Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This is going to be a good time. I've known Grant for a while, and he is definitely somebody whose brain I like to pick a lot, so I'm glad I can do that in a forum where more than just me is learning from it. So let's just start out broad, right? Because your excellent paper covers a lot of different aspects of the energy game in America. So I think as somebody who covers this for a living somehow, there is, I would say, a lack of broad appreciation of exactly how important energy is for the American economy. So let's start there. Just give us the broad strokes of the vision.
Yeah, I think that, before I started studying energy as part of my job, I had no idea. And part of the reason why, as Americans, we have perhaps a limited understanding of how important energy is, both as heat and electricity, is because most of the time it just works. It's in the background. It's keeping our entire modern way of life going. Prices could be higher, they could be lower, they change, and we all experience that in good and bad ways. But you really grow to appreciate the energy when it's not there and in its absence. So right now, we're living through a kind of unique time as far as the last few decades are concerned, where demand for electricity and demand for energy as heat are both increasing for the first time in about 2 decades. And with that, there's a ton of opportunity there. And it's just a question of whether or not we're going to capitalize on it. So you could hear, no matter what paper you're opening, they're talking about artificial intelligence, they're talking about aerospace manufacturing, they're talking about Bitcoin, they're talking about electric vehicles. All of those things are going to require an immense amount of electricity and energy. And you see some of the people in tech concerned that we're not going to have that supply. It's not going to be there. It's going to limit our growth. It's going to limit our possibilities. And those are, private actors that are, they believe that there are really high value uses for that electricity, and they're worried they won't be able to get enough. So that's like that side of it. And then the other side is once you live through a rolling blackout. So about, a little less than 2 years ago, there was Winter Storm Erie on the East Coast. And I don't know if it happened to any of you, but I lost power at my dad's house near the Finger Lakes in Rochester, New York, for about 2 or 3 hours on Christmas Eve. And the great thing about being there with my dad is that my dad has a kerosene heater, he has a grill that runs on gas, and he has oil lamps. So we were able to have, instead of it being this disastrous experience, we were able to eat a cooked steak with good vegetables, and we had candlelight that was reflecting off the Christmas tree, and we were warm. But a lot of people in America want to make it essentially illegal to have gas in your house. They want to make it difficult for you to have these things. They want you to be dependent on the grid, and then they don't want the grid to be reliable. So anyway, I think unfortunately, if we don't get the policy right, many more of us will come to appreciate how important energy is on the bad side of the equation.
Yeah, it is definitely an industry that is at its best when it is at its most silent, and the fact that it is getting loud should be worrying for all of us. I just want to pick up on one strand that you put out there. There's a lot we're going to get to, even from just that opening statement, but I'm a history guy, so I like precedent. I like ways we can use the past to inform what we're going to do in future policy. So what I'm hearing from you is that we are about to have this, or are in the midst of, a big increase in demand for energy and power that we haven't seen in 2 decades. But do we have any precedent that we can operate off of for how we can rise to the occasion of meeting that demand?
Yeah, so the great success story in recent years is the shale revolution. And of course, there's some overlap between that and the past 2 decades. So what was happening there is that other energy sources were displaced, but energy demand did not rise. So just to clarify that. And the reason that shale was so successful and represents this success story is because it was cheaper and it met demands that otherwise were unfulfilled, and allowed them to allowed shale to grow through competition, through innovation, through a market structure that was conducive to those things. So for example, the President's Council of Economic Advisors found in 2020 that the average family of four has saved $2,500 annually as a result of the shale revolution. So if you're living in the world today, that might be, I don't know, 9, 10 trips to the grocery store, maybe fewer depending on where you live. It could be a month's rent. It could be 3 months of your mortgage. Really depends on your cost of living, but that is an extreme amount of savings for Americans out there, American families. And then similarly, another point that I think people don't necessarily appreciate about energy is that at FreeOp, we really focus on policies that will benefit the bottom 50% of income earners. Or that's part of our mandate. And with that, the bottom 20% of income earners in America spend 6.8% of their household budget on energy. So all these regressive energy policies that drive up the cost of energy, make the grid less reliable, all of those are really devastating to the poor and hurt savings, hurt investment, and cause all these different problems.
Wow. Okay. So again, so much there to work with. So, all right. I guess, help me out here. I was just in Houston talking to some people, and I was asking them the same question. So I want to hear your answer to this, which is, why can't we just do that again, right? Why can't we rinse, repeat parts of the shale revolution? Are there major obstacles here? Just fill me in.
Yeah. I think the environment now for this type of innovation in energy is just much worse. Basically, every year, with a few exceptions, it's basically maybe a few exceptions. It's more or less been a one-way ratchet of increasing federal control over all energy investment, of more money for environmental groups suing project owners to prevent them from building critical infrastructure. We really have a regulatory regime in Washington that is extremely top-down, is really seizing control over what types of things are possible, limiting the scope of projects that are available, both through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the EPA, whatever it is. There's just a lot of red tape and a rising amount of red tape to pursuing new project ideas. And then the kinds of critical reforms that we might hope will happen, and that I think most reasonable people who understand the importance of affordable, reliable energy and electricity could agree upon, just can't get over the, get to the finish line, become law. One other piece there is I just think that, I'm trying to think of how to put this, but the other piece is that there's just such a focus on mandates, not only at the federal level, but at the state level. There's a big call to, the way we're going to get our way out of, the way out of this is very clear. We need to pursue these specific assets. The only way to do that is by investing an immense amount of tax credits to make that happen. And it's just a completely different philosophy than what allowed the shale revolution to happen. And that actually inhibits the potentials of other resources by distorting those price signals and by essentially just making it more difficult to invest in these other resources. It makes them, it makes them less attractive than they would otherwise be.
Okay, that's really helpful. So it seems to me like we're all Americans, right? We all know that the entrepreneurial spirit has not yet died in this nation. So we have a lot of untapped potential, a lot of, it sounds like, entrepreneurial energy that would be revved up and raring to go if certain things could just get out of the way. So walk me through a policy framework that might make that happen.
Yeah, so, one thing that I think is, as I brought up, I think is just a huge missed opportunity is at the beginning of the most recent House session, the Republicans came together and put forward the Lower Energy Cost Act. And as I kind of alluded to or said earlier, I think if you read through all of that and you acknowledge the importance of energy for the success of Americans and the kind of health, not only of our economy, but of our people, there's not really a whole lot that you should disagree with there. So for example, and I guess to drive the point home, the Heritage Foundation conducted an economic analysis and found that the Lower Energy Costs Act would reduce energy costs by around $800 annually per household. So, kind of compound on those things. That's a significant part of someone's household budget. And then similarly, they estimate that it would raise the income of households by around nearly $3,000 per year, which is about 4%. Depending on what year's dollars you're using, the number may be a little different these days. But one of the ways in which the Lower Energy Costs Act would do that is by mandating that the Department of Interior offer up these gas leases in the Gulf and in the Atlantic or the Alaskan Continental Ridge, and make those available for development instead of making it easier to leverage not only the human capital but the actual capital, the expertise that we have here in America to produce more energy resources that are demanded both domestically and by our allies abroad. Instead, we're constraining supply. We're saying, oh no, you can't export these resources to our allies. We're just pursuing a energy policy that I think is just very weak. It's making us maybe more open to being dependent on people who are not our geopolitical allies, to put it kind of nicely. And I think, if we're doing that, why don't we just produce the resources here? I think is a really just fundamental question.
Yeah.
And then the Lower Energy Costs Act would also do quite a bit to help reform or kind of mitigate the harms of NEPA, or the National Environmental Protection Act. And essentially with that, it would reduce the scope of litigation that's possible. It would make sure that there are people at specific agencies who are accountable to making a decision and pushing these projects forward, or turning them down quickly. It would reduce the scope of just the forms that need to be filled out and reviewed, and just reduce the timelines of these big projects. And this is more important in a world where capital costs are higher too, because if you're borrowing all this money, how long the project takes can really impact whether or not the project ends up being financially successful. And right now we're living in a world where these projects take way longer than they need to. It's not actually doing anything that, for the most part, they're approving these projects inevitably anyway. They're not too different than what they initially looked like, but instead it took way more time, way more money, and then all of those costs are passed on to Americans. And then there's all these projects, the unseen, that just never happen because it's not worth it,
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that there seems to be a hostility between, or an animus between those who have the responsibility or would like to have the responsibility for delivering megawatts, minerals, and molecules, and those who want to basically, I think, just to be blunt, sort of engage in a kind of lawfare against that. So it sounds to me like what you're suggesting is we need to take some of those tools off the table for those very emboldened groups to hamstring industry in ways that are almost pointless. Like you said, the projects aren't that different. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, I think, and while there are some maybe some positive news on some of these groups maybe changing their tune, I think that in general, kind of excessive litigation has been devastating to the development of projects, even projects that these groups nominally support as environmentalists, whether that's building transmission, that's building solar. They should support nuclear power. Some of them do, some don't. I won't paint with too broad of a brush. But for example, I just had a recent paper come out with REOP about the measurable costs of shutting down the Indian Point reactor outside of New York. And one of the findings from conducting that research, are a few things that really stood out to me. So one, environmental groups with the state of New York ended up costing Entergy, the owner of Indian Point, probably an additional at least $100 million, maybe $2 million to try to keep their operating licenses. That economically was devastating for the project, made them no longer feel like, okay, this is worth fighting for. And since they closed down Indian Point due to this environmentalist, activism, all of the power that was produced by Indian Point, especially during peak times, which is when you most need it, was replaced by natural gas. About 8 million annually, 8 million additional tons of CO2 were emitted into the atmosphere. The price of electricity in 2022, increased, or the wholesale price, like in aggregate for that year, was probably between 200 to 400 million dollars higher than it would have been. And then when you go and look at it, New York says, oh, we're going to decarbonize we're going to get it down so 70% of all electricity generation in New York comes from renewables. They don't say clean energy sources, but renewables. And 95% of all electricity generation in downstate New York comes from natural gas. So while they're hostile to these things, while they're hostile to nuclear, their actions, in fact, have exacerbated the problems that they claim to be against. And then, meanwhile, when you look at upstate New York, I'm from Rochester, so I like to do
Hometown boy.
A little bit here. I was just at Lake Ontario, looking at the aurora borealis with 4 of my best friends. Never thought I'd get to use those string of words together. And I joke that it's my favorite heat sink because there are 3 nuclear plants that dissipate their heat using Lake Ontario. And those 3 plants produce 43% of all electricity for upstate New York and about 20% for the state overall. So anyway, kind of a little bit of a digression there, but...
No, that's great. Hold on to that because we're going to get to nuclear in a minute now, and we'll return to some of those. So I think what we've talked about with this is that we need some reforms at some regulators and the Department of Interior to speed up or make easier the oil and gas leasing process, especially in places where it's been very contentious. And then another prong of this policy strategy is to curtail the amount of litigation that can ruin a profitable and even operating clean energy plant like we have in New York. And there's another element that I think is really worth our time here because I think it's going to become a bigger debate about energy and our relationship, especially to China, which is critical minerals. So right now, we're in a national posture where we are incentivizing, through subsidies, the wind and solar, which China has a lock on almost that entire supply chain, even production process for those things. And some responses on the right are like, we need a counter-industrial policy that would look very, very different, and we need tariff walls and things like this to incentivize extractive industries here in America. I feel like there's another side to that, right? So give me some looks on what not just having the government solve the problem might look like for critical minerals.
Yeah, no, from talking to my friends who work in mining, they're like, it's all regulatory barriers, like let's get that piece in line first, and in the Lower Energy Costs Act, there's very much a specific part of that would amend the FAST Act to basically make some of these, redefine some of these actions no longer as like major federal actions, which are the types of things that have to be approved and go through this NEPA process, and instead just let them develop these projects and make them happen. So yeah, as you said, both the mining, the processing, the production, it's pretty much all controlled by China. The numbers are 65% of all mining, 85% of all processing, and 92% of all production of these critical minerals. And that was through a Senate committee that was like looking into this. It's just like when you look at that, it's like we have the capacity here. We do have these minerals all the time. People are speculating and they're finding them. We have the talent, we have the capital. Again, it's just clearly the regulatory barrier is a probably most of the problem. And I think again, it's just one of those things where it's like we're subsidizing all these resources that people will show you a spreadsheet and they'll say they're inevitable. You already lost. But then we have to subsidize them, and also we can't change our own regulatory structure so that we can actually manufacture them domestically or grab some part of that supply chain. Maybe it won't all make sense. Trading is good. Some of these things could be located elsewhere. It doesn't all need to be located here, but it also doesn't all need to be located in China. So I think that there's clearly, there's no. I don't think there's any shortage of regulatory changes that could be done to open that up and create new opportunities for American industry. So yeah, I think that's just a piece where it's like let's start with the regulatory piece, and I think people underestimate the potential of the American people, of American workers, entrepreneurs, engineers, capital. I like to say that I think we're playing this game with at least one hand tied behind our back, and really my hope is that we can just stop doing that.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so good. That's a great pivot, because I think we're at a unique moment now where we are starting to see things like nuclear power, which used to be a four-letter word, to bring it back to something we were talking about earlier, start to become a little bit more acceptable broadly in the public, but there are, as anyone who's looked at it knows, lots of obstacles to fission in America. So I am wondering if we could talk through some of those obstacles. And I know there's a regulatory component to this, so walk me through what you think might be going wrong up at the governmental end and how we might change that.
Yeah, I mean, so the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has existed for pretty much 50 years at this point, and there have been several plants that were permitted and kind of started under the Atomic Energy Commission, but there have been 2 reactors that have gone from the basic permitting, building, and began operations. So I think it's pretty hard to say that hasn't been a failure. There have been successes. The nuclear industry in the United States is like arguably the safest industry in the United States. There are no deaths associated with it, particularly with the things that people are worried about radiation. Just hasn't been a problem at all. But as we kind of joke, like that it's gone way too far as far as being focused on safety, where essentially the ethos has been, well, let's just not build any, and then there will be no problems, and which is not a very American idea. I think we like to find that balance of risk and reward, and I think that it's even arguable that a lot of these regulations don't make us safer at all, especially once you consider all the other costs. So I think it's pretty clear that it's been a failure. The other point that I'd just like to put out there for those who maybe might disagree, and think that, well, no, it's just those are the only new plants that we're worth creating, and that's a reasonable outcome. Is that if you talk to, there are many companies pursuing advanced reactor designs through the NRC. The only design that's been approved for commercial operations, last I checked, cost $500 million to get through the process there. That's NuScale's Voyager, I believe, design. It just it just doesn't need to be like that. That seems pretty insane to me. And we're at the point where I've talked to some other companies where it's American capital, American entrepreneurs, American engineering, and they're regulatory shopping, and they're building them in Europe. Someone's building something in Europe. They're building nuclear reactors. Like, why is that not happening here? Like, is there really? Do you need too much more evidence that there is a regulatory problem there? From my research, it seems like the policies that the NRC has adopted. Again, a lot of these things are kind of a one-way ratchet. We only add complexity by adding regulations over time. There's not a lot of will to streamline these things, even in ways that seem pretty obvious, or these policies can become very prescriptive over time. Where with the advanced reactors, they've been asking, okay, so where's this component in your design? And they say, well, we don't need that component in our design because it's designed different than the light water reactors you typically have permitted and manage. And then they're like, okay, and so you don't need that component, and who's providing it for you, and are they an approved vendor? So that gives you I think a little inkling of what's kind of going on there. I think as far as where I'd like to, there's lots of different pieces here, but I think one of the things that I would really like to see, which would kind of spur competition, spur innovation while preserving safety, is I think the idea of kind of a nuclear reactor park. So take some of this federal land, maybe leverage some of the existing nuclear competency and the national labs, and create a structure where you filter out unserious people, but all serious people with serious designs can put forward prototypes and then develop more objective criteria and tests for safety. And then if you can pass those tests and we can create a functioning structure for that, we could see a lot more experimentation, maybe find new designs, figure out how to get costs down and have nuclear compete. And until we see some structure that is not so bureaucratic, that isn't just back and forth, where as taxpayers we kind of get to pay, when they're subsidized programs, we kind of get to pay for the subsidies for them to submit the forms, and then we pay the lawyers on the other side to review the forms. And it's like, we could think that to some degree that's necessary, and we may get positive externalities through cheaper energy, but it costs way too much money. There's clearly a better way to do it. So, I mean, that's one of the aspects, but I'm sure we can kick it from there.
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of press you on the advanced reactor thing a little bit. I think that there is a school of thought that says, okay, we've built these two recent Westinghouse AP1000 reactors in Georgia. It was a long, costly, embarrassing process, but we have the workforce there that has the knowledge about how to build them, and the NRC has approved it. So why don't we just stick with that design? Where are the flaws you see in that type of argument, or what would you say to somebody who's saying that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a problem with that kind of argument. I mean, so where I stand is I want to get the regulations to a place where I feel like they are competitive, where we can see new entrants, where we can see innovation, where we can see competition. In general, I think that there's different solutions for different problems, different environments. As like someone who would be investing in a project, you're like, okay, what are your costs? Who are you selling to? How do I get my money back? And for some of those projects, it's not like, hey, we need to build a light water reactor, on the spreadsheet, it'll be cheaper. But yeah, to your point of, okay, we want to, so states say they want to decarbonize. People are starting to shift in their ideas on nuclear. I think recent polling has shown it's bipartisan. There's partisan, or there are people who still have whatever their own anti-nuclear sentiments, but by and large, I think the population has shifted and is in favor of nuclear energy, at least relative to prior times. So why aren't utilities building this? Why can't we get it done? Okay, so those projects where people have gone through and done the postmortem. They were over budget. The designs weren't completed. There was a complete catastrophe in the industry during the process. Like, there are many reasons why those specific projects were so costly. We had to retrain the workforce. And I think the fact that there is that talent, there are those people, that's an asset that we should capitalize on. So I guess the question is almost like, why isn't there a deal being struck that's like, hey, we can do it cheaper. Here's how, I'll take on this risk if you'll pay for it. I think there should be some contract that can be hashed out to build more of these facilities. And what I'd like to see is people structuring those deals and talking to some of these large corporations that do have a lot of money on their balance sheet. And it's like, okay, you might not have too many new ideas. Maybe it's time to put out a dividend. Maybe it's time to buy your stock back. Maybe it's time to build a nuclear reactor. It doesn't have to be a new idea. It could just build a light water reactor, and that'll probably exist for 100 years, maybe more, and it'll be this great thing. But in the short run, it could meet all your demand for power generation. These things take time. Mm-hmm. One of the issues we're dealing with is that putting new supply online takes a lot of time. Demand can shift a lot faster, both at a local level, but even in aggregate, if all this demand kind of plays out the way that utilities are forecasting. But I don't know. I feel like there's an opportunity there, and hopefully some people will start to see it. But I don't particularly think that that's a bad idea.
Right. Okay. So I want to clarify something you brought up because I found it very interesting. If I'm hearing you correctly, what you're suggesting is perhaps in some areas of the country where you aren't encumbered by a monopoly utility, somebody who's going to have a guaranteed amount of demand, let's say an Amazon who's building a big data center or something like that. I feel like I don't feel like it's insane to think that Amazon is going to be around for a while, right? So you're suggesting that maybe could be some kind of behind-the-meter nuclear builds, or flesh that out for me.
Yeah, this is an idea that actually our friend Travis Fisher at Cato has been kicking around too. And that's another regulatory piece that I'm very interested in.
Love Travis. Shout out to Travis.
Shout out to Travis. But essentially, people talk about the difficulty of integrating these new resources into the grid, how that's a huge problem, how we have the supply, it's just not integrated, or it's going to take too long. And once you hear enough of that, you're like, okay, well, if these resources are so great and they're available, why do they need to be on the grid? Like, why can't you co-locate the demand with the supply right there? So we've seen from Amazon and some larger parties, they can go in and be like, hey, we're Amazon, we're good for it. Take a risk on us. We'll consume all you got. But one of the things that Travis has talked about, and something I need to look into deeper, is one of the potential regulatory barriers in some states is that once a power generator starts serving multiple customers, they become regulated like a utility. And it's like, well, you're not the grid. You're not a utility in the same way. It would be terrible if those industrial customers did not have power when they thought they needed it, but it's not the same thing as 20,000 families not having power for 3 days. Like, the risks there are very different, and the regulatory structure should not be the same thing. And if we can open that up and create more opportunities off-grid, then there's the potential for more behind-the-meter development, because then the power generator doesn't have to, their success isn't contingent on one corporation, where it may be okay if it's Amazon, but if it's not Amazon, then you need 3 different customers. You want to spread that risk out there, so that not everything fails at the same time, and your project doesn't go belly up. So in some ways, that regulatory, like the current status quo, allows for Amazon or some of these like super large corporations to benefit from these things, but smaller upstarts or whatever you want to call it are kind of inhibited by the current regulatory structure.
Yeah, I think that there could be a very compelling case for that. So we've talked a lot about stuff at sort of the national or the federal level, and I want to open this up a little bit to some regionalism. Okay, so we've already repped Rochester, where you're from. I know you're bullish on Rochester, but let's talk about, are there parts of the country where you feel like, federal regulations aside, some of these things might be easier achieved than others, or what have you, because state law really matters here too. So tell me about that.
Yeah. So the other bag I currently have. No, I live in Austin, Texas, and I have my criticisms of the current state of the Texas grid and how that's all playing out. But one thing that Texas really has going for it right now is Texas is interested in the potential for more nuclear in Texas. Currently, there are 2 reactors. They provide about 10% of all electricity generation, as I understand it. But there's a governor's commission exploring nuclear. There's a lot of people. There's some people in advanced reactors who are locating there. Some manufacturing happening outside of Houston for certain components for advanced reactors. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Right now, the federal government does have a monopoly on approving new reactors. There are some interesting ideas out there that maybe that shouldn't be the case. People feel differently about that. It's kind of a controversial idea, but personally, I think that one of the issues with the current structure and how accountability is just so diffused throughout the system. You can reasonably blame Congress. You can blame the EPA. You can blame the governor. You can blame the head of ERCOT. And when you're a consumer, I pay my utility bill at the end of the month, and what I think I'm paying for is that I'll have power all the time, and I'll especially have power when I need it. It's not like, oh, I'm paying for it, but if it becomes too cold outside or too hot outside, it's okay. You don't have to give it to me. It's like, no, that's when I most want it. I most want the power and think I'm paying for the power to be there when it would be dangerous for me and my loved ones to not have it. And I think that so consumers think they're paying for that, but instead the way that the system in its current form works is it's just diffused that responsibility. So you can figure out whoever you want to blame. A lot of it ends up being a partisan thing, like whoever's not your guy. But the problem is we increasingly, in some places, have structures where no one's really accountable. And that's not any system people want to opt into.
Yeah, I worry that we might be selling cars where the brakes only work like 99% of the time. But I think we're a little bit over,
Yeah.
right? So we're going to open this up.